Hi there, Professor Zeeb here, and welcome into another video lecture. So this time I'm going to teach you about Erikson's next stage, the stage that's probably most appropriate for early adulthood, and that is called intimacy versus isolation. You know, Erikson basically felt that this was ages 18 to 25, and certainly that was true of his time. But I think in modern times, we could almost apply it to later years as well. Because people are now waiting longer than ever to get married for the first time. So even though Erikson originally called this 18 to 25, you could technically say that it sort of extends beyond that and is applicable to the stage, if you will. Remember, early adulthood technically is our late teens through our 30s. Okay, so we're going to look at Erikson here. Remember, in Erikson's time, 18 to 25, most people really started considered marriage and possibly were married by this time. Once again, if we look at the numbers, we're finding that people are waiting, but we'll kind of look at it from Erikson's perspective in terms of intimacy versus isolation here. All right, so let's set up our slides here. So once again, we're in the stage of early adulthood, roughly late teens through your 30s. Is technically early adulthood, and let's look at Erikson's stage here. So Erikson's stage is called intimacy versus isolation, as we mentioned. Let's define intimacy, so you got to get a feel for that. So intimacy, and by the way, it goes way beyond how people would sort of commonly refer to that word intimacy. Technically, it's the ability to relate one's deepest hopes and fears to another person, and to accept another's need for intimacy in return. In other words, it's not just about sex, it's not just about love, it's going way beyond that, where you can share your deep inner thoughts with someone and have the trust and willingness to do so. In other words, you can completely spill your guts to this person in the hopes that they will not betray you, you have full-on trust with them. So to me, it goes way beyond just a physical relationship. It's going, psychologically and deeper into that, where you're sort of able to share those very deep secrets with someone else, okay? It definitely involves committing to someone based on a mutual trust. So you trust this person enough to be able to share this stuff. And for example, you're committed to them, you trust them that they're not going to go out and betray you and share your secrets or go around and sleep around with other people kind of thing. In other words, you're very deeply committed to this person. Intimacy also involves giving a little bit up of the newfound independence that we have discovered. So obviously through our teenage years, we're breaking away from our parents. We become adults and enter into college. So we have this newfound independence where we're completely, in some cases, independent of everyone else. So if you're agreeing at this time to sort of connect with someone and share these things with someone, you're giving a little bit of that up. So you're giving up a little bit of your independence, okay? And also your interests are not just surrounding your own, it's now surrounding two people, like in a marriage situation and possibly a family. So you're redefining your newfound independence to apply to not only yourself, but this other person that you're sharing it with. So once again, it's a deep commitment in that sense. Obviously, doing this involves a lot of sacrifice. So you're agreeing that you're giving up a lot of different things, including independence, as we said, but potentially it could be a mutual relationship where you're not having relationships with other people sexually, as an example, if that's what your deal is, okay? So in other words, you're making a lot of sacrifices to make this work, and that's showing deep, deep commitment. Now, keep in mind, Erikson also believed that this could apply to friendships as well. It's not necessarily a dating romantic relationship, which typically it probably is, but certainly this could be a best friend. Maybe you just have not met the right person or not seeking that, but you are seeking to connect with someone at this level. It could be certainly a friendship. So once again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a romantic relationship. Erikson believed that intimacy leads to solidarity, what he called, between partners, okay? In other words, it's strengthening the relationship. If you're able to do this with someone and connect at this level, it's really solidifying or strengthening, reinforcing that relationship and making it a strong one compared to people who are not trusting people or willing to commit, for example. So when we look at modern research, obviously this is an older theory. When we look at modern research, research does support the notion that intimacy is a central concern of early adulthood. So a lot of our young adults really start to consider this and think about these things and seek this out. However, these concepts obviously will vary among people, especially in our time frame today, because age is not necessarily tied to this. So even though Erikson called this 18 to 25, today people are waiting and they're often establishing their career first and then seeking those sort of things. So age technically is not completely tied to this due to postponement of relationships because of commitment to career and so on. Okay, so just kind of think about that. Now we're going to look at the counterpart of intimacy. So the counterpart here, or the roots of it, is called distanciation, which basically means the person for some reason is distancing themselves from other people. And a lot of times this is because they feel threatened by other people, okay? And Erikson ultimately believed that this leads to isolation, the counterpart once again, okay? In other words, something's happened where they don't want to connect with people, they're fearful, or they don't trust people, maybe they're paranoid, maybe they've been betrayed in the past, and they don't want to make that connection, so they're keeping themselves distant from people for protection, as an example. In other words, they're isolating themselves from other people for some reason. Well, there's a lot of things that could explain that. Let's just kind of go over some different scenarios, some different things why people would make the decision to distance themselves and be isolated and never get married, as an example, or be committed to someone in that sense. Number one, they could be scared or fearful that they're going to lose their identity. Remember, identity forms up typically during adolescence sometimes a little bit beyond that. So maybe you finally discovered who you are. Well, now if I have to share that with someone, if I have to commit to someone at that level, I may be giving some of that up and losing a part of myself. So some people are so self-focused and so, what's the word I'm looking for, committed to maintaining their identity that they don't want to taint that or change that in any way by committing to someone else. Because obviously, if you become married and start having children, it kind of changes who you are as a person in a great way, by the way. But you could be losing a little bit of your identity. We also know that people that tend to be isolated often are more competitive than cooperative. In other words, these often are competitive people and they want to, for example, they want to be the top dog. So if I'm in a relationship, I have to be making, I have to be calling all the shots and being the boss. I want to completely control things. Well, it's hard to find someone who's going to be completely agreeable to that. Obviously, when you're in a relationship, you give up a lot of things. It's a sort of give and take. You're a team and you're working through it together. It's not someone who's calling all the shots typically. And if someone is, and the other person does not like that. So it could be that the person just does not want to accept a relationship where they're not completely in control, or they're not dominant in that relationship. And therefore they've decided, I don't want to even deal with that because I want to be in control. I want to be the boss kind of thing. Finally, some people isolate themselves because they feel threatened. They feel threatened by other people for some reason. For example, maybe they were married before, the person cheated on them or they betrayed them in some way, and therefore they don't want that to happen again. So they're protecting themselves, they're isolating themselves because I never want to go through that again. Or maybe they're just mistrustful of people, or something is bothering them about giving in to someone or relating these things to someone because I may be betrayed and hurt in the long run. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. So some people take this lone wolf sort of stance because they don't want to get hurt. They feel threatened by others. They want to be the boss. They don't want to lose parts of themselves, all the stuff that we just mentioned. Okay, so that will sort of conclude our short lecture on Erikson's early adulthood stage of intimacy and isolation. Please move on to the next step in the class.